So, welcome. So, you and I are in for a treat tonight. We have Kathie Snow as our special guest, and I'm very excited because Kathie has been a friend of mine for, I was trying to figure that out, I think over 25 years. And she has always been that best friend, but also a mentor. I can always depend on talking to Kathie and having her help get my perspective straight when I feel, like there's no chance of making change. And she helps me get back on track for what we need to be doing for our kids. So I'm excited. If you haven't been on a Facebook Live show with me before, I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a parent, an advocate, a retired teacher, and author of the #1 best-selling book, The Art of Advocacy, A Parent's Guide to a Collaborative IEP Process. So welcome, Kathie. Kathie's going to be talking to us tonight about disability is natural, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So, Kathie, is there anything else you'd like to say in the way of an introduction?
Well, first, just thank you, Charmaine. And we used to live in the same small town in Colorado. And she moved to Idaho, and we moved back to Texas. So now we communicate in lots of different ways instead of, as Charmaine said in our email the other day, we used to go to Wendy's and have hot chocolate on a cold winter night. So now we just see each other in different ways. So thank you so much, Charmaine, for this wonderful opportunity. It's great to be with you and your Facebook audience. And I hope people will go to my website, which is just as the logo says, Disability is Natural, disabilityisnatural.com, of course. And we have over close to 300 articles that people are welcome to download and share with other people, email them to people, read them, make copies of them, all kinds of different ways of thinking about disability. And that's sort of what my shtick is, of new ways of thinking about disability. And I have several books, including Disability is Natural, Revolutionary Common Sense for Raising Successful Children with Disabilities. And that covers everything from birth through young adulthood. So it's in the 3rd edition now. A lot of universities using it to train emerging professionals. Parents buy it, educators buy it, professionals buy it. So there's all kinds of other products on there that I've created about 31 different designs of new ways of thinking about disability that we turn them into, excuse me, there's Kermit the Frog in my throat. We turn them into posters and bookmarks and badges and refrigerator magnets. So that's my 15 seconds of shameless self-promotion. So I wanted to share, I do a lot of presentations all around the country. I've been doing this now for close to 26 years. And so I'm going to give your audience a brief overview of some of my presentations, but about how I think that we can make changes in our own attitudes and our actions, and that will in turn lead to changes in our children's lives or our families' lives or the lives of people with disabilities that are not even yet born, or that we might not know, but it's going to change our society in the process. And my hope and my goal, and I'd really like to see it in my lifetime, is that all people live real lives in the real world. And I would want that to be true for people with and without disabilities. And it usually happens for people without disabilities, but far too often it doesn't happen for children and adults with disabilities. They end up in what I call disability world. So instead of going on that wonderful straight line that everybody else goes to, they get shuttled off into, again, disability world, which is a small place and a dark place. And it's a world of special. And we don't really mean special, but that's what it ends up being. It's a world of services. And for too many people, it becomes lifelong segregation. So, whether that's like segregation in special preschools or in high schools or elementary schools, and then when people get to be adults, they're segregated in group homes and day programs and other places like that. And what that ends up resulting in is this horrendous, shameful, horrific 75 to 90% unemployment rate. And so we're not just talking about people that don't have a job. We're talking about adults who are living below the poverty line on SSI, supplemental security income. Most of them are living in a group home with people they don't really know. They're in a day program or a workshop. In other words, they're segregated. And this is not what most parents dream of for their children, but this is the result of receiving, for too many children with disabilities, a substandard, quote unquote, special education where they're, life skills education, which is not going to get you a job. It's not going to get you into college or or any kind of post-secondary education. And so this is not what most parents dream of for their children, but this is what the reality is. So I know that we can change things, as I know that you did in your son's life, Charmaine, and then we did in our son's life, in Benjamin's life. And if you go to when you go to our website, you'll see a page there about Benjamin. But Benjamin has the diagnosis of cerebral palsy, and he uses a power wheelchair and a lot of assistive technology devices. Benjamin doesn't write with a pencil. He writes everything on the computer. If you were up to the kindergarten teacher and the occupational therapist, my son would still be in kindergarten because they said you have to write with a pencil. I was like, no, he doesn't. And so Benjamin has earned his master's degree, and he actually does a little presentation called "You Don't Have to Write with a Pencil to Go to College." So Benjamin's got his college degree, and now he's on the job hunt just like a lot of other college graduates are. So, we know, and Charmaine's son has been to college. Those of you that know her family story and on her Facebook page, that Dylan's gone to college, and so we know that we can get different outcomes, but that means that we have to essentially develop a new way of thinking. And so I'm going to share with you, briefly some revolutionary common sense. And I call it revolutionary common sense because I think most of it is just common sense, but we sort of lost our common sense about disability issues, probably 2 or 3 thousand years ago. And so I think that we'd like to try to get our common sense back. And again, to embrace some new ways of thinking. And most of what I'm going to share with you, and most of what I share in most of my work and my articles that I write, the newsletter that I have, the presentations I do in my book, most of what I've learned, I'm not smart enough to have figured it out. I have learned from the people that I consider to be the true experts in the field. And a lot of people would say, oh, the true experts are parents. Professionals say that they're the experts. Well, the reality is that the true experts are people with disabilities themselves, including, if you're listening as a parent, your child is a bigger expert than you are. Of course, you're the parent, and you need to act like a parent and be responsible for your child. But I can never know what it's like to have a developmental disability. I can only know what it's like to be the mother of someone with a developmental disability. And so the same is true whether or not you've got a 2-year-old or you've got a 30-year-old. Or if you're a teacher, you cannot know everything it is to know what that child is like. Or if you work in the field, you cannot know what it's like to be a person with a disability. Only the person with a disability knows. So we have to learn and listen from them. And I started learning from adults when my son was very young through the Partners in Policy Making Leadership Training Program. And that's another great website for you to visit is thepartnersinpolicymaking.com. It'll put up a different URL, but if you type that in, it'll get you there. And I started learning from adults, and they started telling me their personal stories of what it felt like growing up with a disability, getting all the therapies and being segregated and all the things that we, take as the norm to do for or to children with disabilities. And nothing, though, is more succinct than the quote I want to put up next for you. And it's from a woman named Dr. Margaret Steinman. And there was an article that I read about her, an interview with her on an internet newspaper several years ago. But her story illustrates the same stories I've been hearing for 26 years, because these stories have not changed, sadly, in 26 years. And Dr. Margaret Steinman was born with, and she works for Medicare now, and she writes Medicare policy, lives in Washington, D.C. And she's an author and an artist and a public speaker and a professional and, medical doctor. And she was born with a lot of, quote unquote, bone deformities. And so as a child, she had many disabilities. She was given therapy after therapy and, surgery after surgery. And she looked in this interview, she was looking back over her childhood, and she said, I felt as a child they kept trying to fix me, but nobody was helping me learn how to live with the way I was. And so we did, from what I learned from adults when our son was young, we made real significant changes in his life to make sure that he was always included, to make sure that he as a child stopped going to therapy at age 6. And I'm not saying that therapists are bad people, they're not. But we need therapists as consultants to teach us as parents or child care providers or family members how to incorporate beneficial activities throughout the person's day instead of like trying to, do therapy on them. And one of the other things that we realized was that every single child is born included. And so, we thought our daughter Emily was born included. She would always be included. We thought, why wouldn't Benjamin be included? And so we, again, made some very specific active decisions to make sure. And again, Charmaine, did very similar things with her son Dylan, of making sure that Benjamin was always included, because inclusion is the natural state. I mean, you're going to be included unless, we assess you and test you and call an IP meeting and decide that you're not going to be included, and we're going to put you in some kind of segregated setting. And so we thought we're just going to make sure that Benjamin, was always included. And so he has been. And it's, I know that his life today would not be what it is had he not grown up being included in, community activities and, just regular, quote unquote, regular Cub Scouts, church when they were little, Sunday school, T-ball, all the things, karate, all the things that every child grows up doing. Children with disabilities can do those things, and it doesn't have to be in a separate special program. It can and should be in just a regular neighborhood community activity. What I realized is, and going back to what Dr. Margaret Steinman said about, us trying to fix children, is that we focus a whole lot of energy on trying to, treat them or fix them or interventions and therapies and stuff. And we focus a lot on their bodies and brains, but in the process we can cause great harm to their hearts and minds, because if you're made to feel like you're not okay because you have to go to special programs or you're in special education, and we're trying to work on all these goals, and essentially try to fix you, then how can you feel good about yourself? And so I think that we need to focus more on our children's hearts and minds, or of adults with disabilities too that might be in our lives, of focusing on their hearts and minds, and that they know that they're valued and they're loved and they're appreciated and they're valued just the way they are without having to change them. All of us have the best of intentions. I mean, I had the best of intentions when my son was very young, before he made the decision to not go to therapy anymore, of getting him therapy. And we're basically doing therapy 7 days a week. I mean, I was therapy mom of the year. So I had the best intentions, but what were the unintended consequences? And the unintended consequences was my son, and really his sister, who was 2 years older, didn't have much of a normal childhood. Not because my son had a disability, because I mean he did have a very, very normal childhood later after he stopped going to therapy and doing all that kind of stuff. But neither did his sister. She didn't have any kind of normal childhood, and so there were many, many unintended consequences of doing all the things that we think that we're supposed to do, instead of saying, well, let's do what's really makes sense to us. And again, this is where sort of the common sense comes in. That if all your time is spent doing special things, then how do you learn to live any kind of regular life? The only thing you know is essentially special, and that kind of means segregated. And so one of the things that we need to do is to have some new ways of thinking. We also have to recognize that every single day, every single minute, every single hour, every single week, we are making memories. Our children are making memories. And so again, learning from adults with disabilities, of them looking back over their lives from the time they were little bitty kids, what kind of memories are we making for our children? I realized when my son was very young, and I was meeting, my son was 3, a little big kid, and I thought I knew a lot at the time, which, but you don't know what you don't know, right? And so I thought I knew a lot until I started learning from adults with disabilities, and, adults with cerebral palsy and autism and Down syndrome and, fetal alcohol and, whatever, you name it. I met them, got to know them. They became my friends. They became my mentors. And it's hard for them to look back on their, growing up with any kind of joy or positive memories, because all their memories are, people working on them, people trying to change them through therapies or special education goals or whatever. And so that's hard. And so, we really need to take the short-term view, in a sense of what kind of day is our child going to have tomorrow, as well as the long-term view of, day after day after day, what messages are they getting? What kind of lives are they living? Is the day that they're living tomorrow and the next day helping prepare them to be successful as an adult, as opposed to working on, achieving the pencil grasp? In the big scheme of things, the pencil grasp is not the most important thing in a child's life. Trust me, my son doesn't have it either, and he's got his master's degree. Okay. And so, with that in mind, this new way of thinking is for us to deconstruct disability, and recognizing that what we call a disability is just a social political construct. And so disability essentially is what the government says it is. So we're not going to, deconstruct disability at the federal government level or your state level or your school level. But if we deconstruct it in our own hearts and minds, then we can make some progress. And so first and foremost, we have to recognize that a disability or the diagnosis is just a passport for services or for legal status. And so that's fine. Like, you have to have the diagnosis or the disability label to qualify for, particular service or entitlement or whatever. And that's okay. The problem is how we use labels, that they can create thinking errors on our part, which can lead to very, very negative consequences for the children and adults that become labeled. So the first thing we have to recognize is that a disability is just a medical diagnosis. I've got some medical diagnosis. I got myopia. I've got my glasses or my contacts on. Some of us have sciatica. Some of us have arthritis. Whatever they are. My diagnosis, your diagnosis, is not the defining characteristic of who you are. You don't go and share it with every Tom, Dick, and Harry, everybody you meet. But that's not what we do to kids and adults with disabilities. unfortunately, their diagnosis becomes a defining characteristic in our minds of who they are. And that's what I mean. It's, it's okay to have a diagnosis. It's okay to have a disability, but it's how we use it, how we process it, how we perceive the person. So, my son has cerebral palsy, but that's not who he is. Benjamin has many, many, many characteristics and traits that make up his whole persona, just the way I do too. So again, my diagnosis doesn't define me. My son's diagnosis shouldn't define him. If you're a parent, your child's diagnosis should not define who your child is. So we have to treat our children's diagnosis just the way we do our own, which is we keep them private. I mean, there are times we need to share some stuff with other people, but it's not anything that we should, again, be blurting out. Oftentimes, unfortunately, and I've learned this from doing presentations for all these years, of a parent will come up to me in the middle of a presentation at a break or at the end of the day and say, okay, Kathie, I want to ask you about my kid. And, my kid has, fill in the blank, whatever the diagnosis is, and blah, 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 and but all the negatives. And I'll just stop the parent and I'll say, wait a minute, what is your child's name? So a parent is telling me all this stuff about her child, basically all the negatives, the diagnosis, all the problems, without even saying her child's name. So if that's the way we see our children, then how do they learn to see themselves? Because our children can only see themselves essentially through our eyes. And so we have to recognize how powerful our actions are, how powerful our words are to the children. So you have to remember also, Norman Cousins, the great author, wrote, never deny the diagnosis, but always deny the negative prognosis. And what we're talking about here is the death of dreams. That as parents, when we get our child's diagnosis from the doctor or the educators, whoever gives it, we essentially are told, don't dream for your child anymore. Well, we realized early on, this is the thing. I mean, I've done a lot of things I wish I could redo. And if anybody reads some of my articles or my books, you'll see the stories. I'm not going to take the time to tell them all tonight, or we'd never get through. But one thing I did okay on was we realized that we needed to have the same dreams for Benjamin that we had for him before the diagnosis, the same dreams we had for our daughter. And so as parents, we need to support our children's dreams. Now, somebody will say to you, which they've said to me, oh, you need to be realistic. No, we don't. We're not realistic with kids who don't have disabilities. So when my son was little bitty and he was 3 years old, he'd seen a lot of doctors. He said one time when he grew up, he wanted to grow up to be a doctor. And I said, good, they make a lot of money and you can take care of me and daddy. Well, I was told, oh, you can't talk to your son like that. He'll never be a doctor. And, he has cerebral palsy. And I was like, if your daughter, I said as a person, if your daughter told you, when she grows up, she wants to be a doctor, you might think that's the wackiest idea you ever heard, but you would never say that to her, because we don't do that to kids who don't have disabilities. We say, you might think that, oh boy, there's no way this kid could be a doctor, get to medical school, but you would never say that to your child. And so we have to do the same thing with our kids with disabilities as we do our children that don't have disabilities, and we have to support their dreams. And that means saying, well, we'll see, wow, that's a good idea. I never heard that. Just say the same things you'd say to your child who does not have a disability, and help them learn about it. Maybe they don't really want to be that when they grow up, but they think they do, and once they learn about it, they might not. But if we don't dream for our children, then how do they learn to dream for themselves? And see, if you crush somebody's hopes once, you pretty much crushed them forever. They'll be afraid to ever share a dream with you out of fear that you'll tell them, you can't do that either. So then they just give up. And so again, deconstructing disability, I recognize that the DD Act, the Developmental Disabilities Act, first passed in the mid-1970s, says disability is a natural part of the human experience. There have always been people with disabilities in the world. There always will be. This is the inspiration for the name of my book and my website. When I first heard this when my son was 3, and I realized it is as natural for my son to have cerebral palsy as to not have it. It's as natural for a child to have Down syndrome or autism or anything else as to not have it. Again, there have always been people with disabilities in the world. There always will be. Those of us who presently do not have a disability, if we live long enough, we will have one due to an accident, illness, or the aging process. So really all we have to do is think about, what do I want when it's me? Not if, but when. What do you want when it's you? Not if, but when. If you acquire a disability, what kind of life would you want to live? And really it becomes really that simple. We also have to recognize that a disability is just a body part that works differently. Does anybody have a normal body? Because if you know of one, I'd like to see it, because I don't think I've ever seen a normal body. So in my son's case, his eyes work differently. He has a low vision diagnosis, so he needs large print. His legs work differently, so he needs a power wheelchair. His fingers work differently, so he needs a laptop computer and adapted silverware and other kinds of assistive devices. All of our body parts work differently. You have a child with Down syndrome, they're going to learn differently. If you have a child with autism, they're going to communicate differently. So it's just a body part that works differently. In contrast to talking about what's wrong with a child, and when we do this all the time, we talk about what's wrong with them. there's nothing wrong with you if you have a disability. You just have a body part that works differently, and we have to embrace that language and make sure that our children here is speaking that way. Because I have a quote in my book that I'll share with you now from a woman who says, "Do you know what it's like to feel wrong 24 hours a day? Do you know what it's like to be disapproved of, not only for what you do and say and think, but for who you are?" So we have to take that word wrong out of our vocabulary. I mean, if you grow up as a child hearing your parents or your teachers or therapists or whomever talk about what's wrong with you, how do you make yourself right in the eyes of those folks? How do you grow up feeling that you're wrong as a human being? And so again, our words, our attitudes, our language, all those things are so powerful and so totally influence how a child grows up and how he or she feels about themselves. I didn't put this on a slide, but I don't know if any of you have ever read anything by Alfie Kohn. I know that Charmaine has Alfie, Alfie Kohn, Kohn. And one of the articles he's got a lot of books. And one of his articles, he talked about it's not so much of what we do, but it's how children experience what we do. And that goes along with my earlier slide where I talked about having the best of intentions, but there being unintended consequences. We all have the best of intentions, but as Alfie Kohn talks about, it's not what we as adults do or what we as teachers do, in whatever our role is in the life of a child. It's how children experience that, and we have to keep that in mind. Finally, in deconstructing disabilities, it's a consequence of the environment. When our son has his power wheelchair and has the assistive technology device, it's in an accessible environment, has whatever supports and accommodations he needs, he no longer has a disability. He still has cerebral palsy, but that's just a medical diagnosis. And so I would ask you, does a person always have a disability? I would say it depends on what kind of environment they're in. So if we took away my son's power chair, put him in an environment where he doesn't have the supports and assistive technology and accessibility that he needs, we can make Benjamin have a severe and profound disability. We can make him helpless or dependent. Or we can provide him the environmental modifications he needs, and he no longer has that disability. Again, he still has cerebral palsy or low vision, but we've given him the tools to essentially level the playing field and give him what he needs to be successful. So again, we don't need to change children and adults with disabilities. We need to change the environment. If we change the environment, then their disabilities essentially become pretty much irrelevant. And so then we think about how important language is. And I didn't spend a whole lot of time on this because, not that it's not vitally important, but I have on my website, disabilitiesnatural.com, there's an entire section on people first language and other articles about communication and perceptions and stuff. And so people first language is very, very important, that it puts the person first. It was started by people with disabilities themselves who said, I'm not my disability, I'm not my diagnosis. But people first language is more accurate and respectful. It really represents good manners, and it's not about political correctness. Okay, people say, "Oh, there's that PC stuff." No, I mean, I don't go around wanting to be known by my diagnosis. You don't want to be known by your diagnosis, and the same is true for people with disabilities. When we do need to share information about our children, we need to share what their needs are, not their diagnosis. One mom told me years ago, "Oh, Kathie, no, I tell people when I'm going to enroll my daughter, in an activity or whatever, that she has Down syndrome, so people will know what she needs." What? No two people with Down syndrome have the same needs. No two people with autism have the same needs. Each person is unique. But if we share the diagnosis, then people go to stereotypes. Oh, autism, they know what that means. No, they really don't. Oh, Down syndrome, they know what that means. No, they really don't. And it's not a case of being ashamed of the disability. That's not it at all. It's about sharing what's relevant about the person. So I would need to say about my son, instead of telling somebody he has cerebral palsy, I would say my son's going to need wheelchair access. He's going to need large print. He's going to need, access, all those things that Benjamin needs. And of course, as soon as he could speak for himself and share what he needed, that he would do that. But that means we need to reframe problems instead of needs. And we don't always say problems, but we say can't or doesn't. So again, if I talked about my son, I could say, well, Benjamin has a problem walking, or Benjamin can't walk. Well, Benjamin has a problem writing with his finger, writing using his hands, or writing with a pencil, or has a problem feeding himself, or can't go to the bathroom by himself. Or I can reframe it and say my son needs or uses a power wheelchair. Benjamin needs adaptive silverware so that he can eat by himself. Benjamin needs a little help going to the bathroom. So you can see there's a huge difference in perception and self-perception. Again, I don't go around talking about my problems all the time. I don't say I have a problem seeing. I say I need my glasses, or I wear glasses, or I wear contacts. And so just a few examples here, and there's actually an article on the website about that, about the problem with the word problem, because people with disabilities, they hear that all the time. They think that they're just a big bundle of problems, and they're not. And so instead of talking about a child, having behavior problems, say my child needs behavior supports, or instead of saying she's nonverbal, she communicates with or by. Instead of saying he doesn't read or doesn't read at grade level, he learns through activity. So just, think about if you're a parent or a teacher, think about a child with a disability in your life and think about your own self of, you don't talk about your problems, you talk about your needs. How do we do the same thing for a child or an adult with a disability? We also have to stop apologizing and explaining for our children. This especially, a lot of parents do this, but parents of kids with autism tend to do this more than most. And this is just from my personal experience of doing this again for 26 or 27 years. A child with autism goes ballistic in the grocery store checkout line. He's screaming, he's, perseverating, he's flapping, he's doing all this stuff. Mother, everybody's stopping and staring. The mother grabs him by the hand and says, well, he has autism. And I said, well, you're apologizing, you're explaining. No, Kathie, I want people to understand that, he's doing this as part of his disability. That's well, that sounds real good in theory, but really it's not about him at all. It's about you, that you don't want people thinking you're a bad mother that's raised a brat. Because here's the parallel. How many times have we seen, say, a 4-year-old who doesn't have autism go ballistic in the grocery store checkout line? Doing the same things this kid with autism is doing. Does that mother grab the kid by the hand as everybody's stopping and staring and say, well, he takes after his father? Well, you might like to do that, but you don't, because you know what? It's nobody's business. We do not need to explain all about our children. If forget disability for a minute, if you had a daughter that was like super, super skinny or super, super fat, and some stranger came up to you and said, God, how did you let her get that way? Well, you'd smack them upside the head. And the same is true. People say, well, shouldn't we educate people? Yes, but not at the expense of our children's privacy and dignity. We owe our children their privacy and their dignity. And so one of the things we have to do, and again, there's another article on the website about this. And if you can't find some of these articles, just go to the contact us form and you can email me and I'll send it to you. But it's called Humor to the Rescue. We have to use humor. If we don't use humor, we will commit murder or suicide, and neither one of those are acceptable. So, we learned early on, we get stared at unmercifully. Wave at people. Hey, how are you doing? Okay, they'll turn away from you. This does not come naturally. You have to kind of practice it. But, I'm a good brainstormer. So if you have an issue with that, email me. I'll help you brainstorm that and move beyond it. This whole developmental age, chronological age thing, this is very, very dangerous. Yes, you might need it for eligibility purposes. In some cases, if a child is, a big discrepancy between their chronological age and their developmental age, they're eligible for services. But this is very, very harmful. It's especially harmful for our children hear this, that I've met parents that say, okay, Kathie, I have a 10-year-old, but he functions at the level of a 5-year-old. And I say, what? First of all, how can that be? A 10-year-old has lived 5 more years than a 5-year-old, so there's no way he could be that. What we've done is we test kids at the wazoo, right? Developmental, receptive language, expressive language, gross motor, fine motor, all these different tests. And then we find a discrepancy, but then instead of leaving it at that one area, we generalize it to the whole child. So in my son's kindergarten IEP meeting, the physical therapist was reading her report and she said he's, 5 years old, blah, blah, and he functioned to the level of an 8-month-old. What? An 8-month-old? There's no way he was like an 8-month-old, but on a gross motor scale, you're supposed to start sitting up and crawling and rolling over and all this stuff when you're 8 months of age. Well, Benjamin never did, and he never will. So on his tombstone, somebody could say, lived to be 100 and had 3 PhDs, but functioned to the level of an 8-month-old on a gross motor scale. And so we need to be very, very precise in using these only for the purposes they are intended. If, again, you need to get services, but we cannot think of our children that way, and we cannot let other people think of our children that way. Never ever compare a child with a disability to others, but only to himself. But of course, that's what all those tests do. So, and Charmaine and I were of like mind when our children were younger. That once Benjamin got to kindergarten, I never let him be tested again. I said, if you want to know my son, you come talk to him, come play with him. But no, you're not going to give him those silly standardized tests, because that's what those do. They compare you to some kind of norm, and then our children are never ever seem to be right or to norm or whatever. Furthermore, because we test them against this norm, we're always focused on what they cannot do instead of focusing on what they can do. And so literally we cannot see what they're doing. So actually when Benjamin was about, 4 was the last time he was tested, and that was it. But at age 3, when he started talking, he loved Thomas the Tank Engine, and he could do a British accent like Thomas the Tank Engine. Well, I would say to all the professionals, look, let's Benjamin, do your accent. It was irrelevant to them because it wasn't on the chart of the test. And so I realized then, look at all these great things that Benjamin can do, but nobody, all these professionals, they can't see it because they're only focused on what he can't do. Theodore Roosevelt said it best. He said, comparison is the thief of joy. And so all too often, we as parents allow other people to compare our children to other children, and they rob us of the joy of our children. Worse, sometimes we as parents rob our own children of joy when we compare them to other kids or them to their brothers and sisters, that they're not doing this or they're not doing that. And so we have to get beyond that. We need to let our children be joyous in their accomplishments. We need to be joyous in their accomplishments and not let other people take those from us. So we think back to the beginning when we started of, that a label is a passport to services, then the passport to inclusion is a person, a child's label of their abilities and their talents and their interests and their strengths and their similarities. These are all the things, and many more. These are all the things that help people without disabilities to be successful. And so these are the same things that can help a child or an adult with a disability be successful. These are the things we need to focus on. And so our job really is to assume the best. We've for too long assumed the worst about our children and others with disabilities. We need to assume the best. And we actually sell this as a poster. And finally, our big job then is also to believe in, have big dreams and high hopes and great expectations for our children and anybody else that has a disability. This really is what our most important job is. So I'm going to wrap up our little talk, and we're going to have time for Charmaine and I to talk or to have some questions. But again, hopefully you will go to my website, it's disabilitiesnatural.com, and then there's a lot of articles there. There are also a link to our store. There's pages about us, so you can learn more about me and our son and my husband. This is a tiny little family-run business. We have a little cottage industry here. People think I have a big secretary. I've got staff. No, it's just me, myself, and me. And I know Charmaine knows what that's like. So I'm going to jump out of these slides, and I think I'm going to do this the way Charmaine told me to do it, if I'm doing it right. And let's see, Charmaine. I think my big screen is gone. Let's see, maybe if I can get it back up here. I'm not quite sure. I'm not as technologically savvy as. Oh, that's not it.
Well,
Charmaine.
that's your website showing.
Oh, did that come up for a second? Okay, I could put that up here.
If you go to Safari, yeah.
There's part of the website. So there's a little slideshow of some of our products and stuff. What a great idea. Inclusion works. Yes, it does. So yeah, so go there now. Charmaine, do I need to click on this the slide, the picture that you're on to see?
You need to say stop sharing screen.
Well, that little thing is, oh, there we go. It went away. Okay.
So there you go.
Okay.
Yay.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I love when technology does what we want it to do, right?
It's great when it does that.
I know. Well, I just, I don't know. I just feel like I always learn from you, Kathie, and it's not like I haven't heard you say these things before, or it's not that I haven't said similar things to families, but it's always a good reminder to make sure we have that, at the forefront of our thoughts, and because that drives what actions we take. So we need to change and sometimes flip our thinking when we get stuck and when we start getting down about, depressing things that the school might be telling us about our kids, and, help the educators see that there's a different way of how they can perceive and, how much impact teachers have when they talk about students and how their classmates hear things that are said about them. I don't know if, I know you speak all over the country, you speak in Canada, and, do you have a sense of changes from, 26 years ago? And as far as inclusion, don't shake your head.
Well, and that's what's really sad. I mean, when Dylan was a little kiddo, and I mean, we met when our kids were, 4 and 2. Dylan was 2 and Ben was 4. And, if you'd have told me, that 25 years later, things would pretty much still be the same, or in some cases have gotten worse. And I don't mean to be a downer on that. I mean, our families, your family, our family, the families that are watching this, we are free to make whatever choices. We do not have to be bound by what professionals tell us to do. I mean, the federal government, the states are mandated to offer us certain things, but that doesn't mean we have to take them. And I think that we have to stop and think, yeah, yes, they're offering me early intervention for my child. Yes, they're offering a special preschool placement, or yes, they're offering, but I mean, they even hate the word placement. I mean, like our kids are like pieces of furniture. We're going to place them somewhere. It's like, no, our kids are little kids, and they gotta, if you're a stay-at-home mom, they stay at home with you. If your kids go to the neighborhood child care, I mean, Charmaine, that's what you did with Dylan. He didn't go to the special ed preschool. My son, we chose not to go to the special ed preschool. He went to the neighborhood preschool, and gosh, if it's a 4-year-old Benjamin didn't want to go one day, he didn't go. I mean, it's like, 4-year-olds say, "I want to stand with you, mommy." Okay. Oh, but if he, especially in preschool, unexcused absence, and you gotta, it's like what? I mean, our kids have got to be kids. But I think that's why I think for the short term of, I mean, as far as like professionals in our lives, are they helping make our children's lives better right now? I mean, like, if you've got a 4-year-old, or are therapists or other people helping your 4-year-old be successful 4-year-old right now? Or are they working on, going to get the kid ready? The kid is ready right now. And so, we sort of end up holding children in sort of this state of suspended animation that we're not going to let them do what other 4-year-olds do until they're like a 4-year-old. Well, that means you can walk and talk and do all this stuff. It's like, my son's never going to do some of those things. Your child might not do, but they still need to be able to live like a 4-year-old. And back to something you first said, Charmaine, of whenever we're around educators, that I mean, parents have to keep in mind that it's all the diagnoses, it's all the levels of problems that are valuable to teachers and educators, in the sense that those are the things that drive the services provided to the child. And so as parents, what we think we want, what we've learned, I mean, what the system has taught us is, let's have as many problems and diagnoses as possible, because then our children get more services. So on the way to the IP meeting, we go through the diagnostic drive-through, right, and pick up 4 or 5 more, and go to the IP meeting, and have our laundry list of problems of our child, and we say, oh, and by the way, I want my child to be included. And the educators look at you and say, lady, your kid's got too many problems to be included, and you've just shot yourself in the foot, and you didn't even know it, because usually it shouldn't have to be this way. And where Charmaine and I's children went to school, it wasn't this way. But generally, the more problems you have and the more services you get, that means the more segregated you are, because schools are still not practicing inclusive education of putting the child, according to what the law says, in the neighborhood school in an age appropriate general ed classroom with supports, blah blah blah, right? And then bringing those supports and services to the child, we force the child to go to the services. So again, the more problems you have, the more whatever. But the sad thing about that is that when we adopt that lingo, when we adopt the system's methods of identifying all these problems and stuff, then we end up actually seeing our children that way. And then we cannot see the strengths they have. So then we're at a real deficit of going to that IEP meeting, Charmaine, as you know, and of bragging about all the great stuff our children do, because we can't see those things anymore. We're so focused on what the child is not doing.
Right.
And if we don't see the great thing, if we as parents don't see the great things our kids are capable of or are doing, or their strengths or their abilities and their gifts and their talents, if we don't see those, then how do we expect other people to see them?
Oh, exactly. And so sometimes, I'll say to families that I'm helping, advocate for, that less can be more. And sometimes they just look at me and it's like, what? Shouldn't we be trying to get all these things? And it's like, not necessarily. And, it's kind of that be careful what you ask for. And I see that, I guess, especially when I see parents wanting that one-on-one aid for their child. So I don't know if you can address, how
Actually,
the,
Charmaine, I have an article that's entitled just that, when less is more. And that is that, I mean, for those of you that know Charmaine, so again, Dylan didn't have a one-to-one aide. Benjamin did not have it. There were teachers' aides in the class to help all kids, and there were certain things that only an adult could do for Benjamin. But my rule for Benjamin, starting in kindergarten, that I told the principal, and the principal at this wonderfully inclusive school was very supportive of this. I said, I only want my son to get help from an adult if it's something a child cannot do, because he didn't need an adult to help him take his coat on or get his backpack off his wheelchair. A friend could do that, and that's what we all want. I mean, the aide, a paraprofessional, teacher, whatever, put different labels on them. They pretty much just get in the way of a child actually making friends. A child also learns to be helpless and dependent. And if you're helpless and dependent, you're gonna end up being excluded and segregated because you are dependent. And so that's the easiest way for a child. And I do a whole presentation just on that of living real lives and dreaming big dreams of talking about learned helplessness. And that's what it's called, learned. Children learn to be helpless. And yeah, there's a lot of things that my son can do. There's a lot of things that I'm never going to be able to do. And so I need all the help that I can get too. But we don't want children to learn to be helpless because we put so much assistance in their lives. And again, if the aid is in there all the time, in a general ed classroom, the classroom teacher never gets to know that child. The classroom teacher doesn't know how to help. I've talked with parents who have told me that uh, they'll get a call at 7 o'clock in the morning from the school saying, "Don't send your child to school today because the aide called in sick," because only the aide knows how to help that child. It's like, that's ridiculous. What if the aide dies? I mean, it's like, what, the kid can't go back to school? And so, Benjamin has always wanted, and now as a young adult, he still wants help from his peers, not from me or his dad or from somebody who's paid to be in his life. And Dylan's the same way. I mean, you know, and
Right.
our children also cannot just be the recipients of help because that feels awful. I mean, we look at kids with disabilities and think that they're needy, NEEDY, but they need to be needed. I mean,
Right.
all children want to be needed, and so it's important that we find ways for our children with disabilities who might have great difficulty doing certain things that they are needed by other people. They're needed by their families to help with chores or to help a little brother or sister or to help a classmate in school, to be volunteers in their community. Everybody needs to be needed, and there's another article that's entitled just that: "Everyone needs to be needed."
Oh, exactly. And and I think, one of the things that comes to mind is when Dylan was taking a high school class and the teacher wasn't requiring him to take any tests in the class, which, you would think most kids would go like, "Yes, I don't have to take a test." But for Dylan, he came home and he was really sad. And I was like, "What's bothering you?" And it's like, the teacher doesn't think I'm good enough. The teacher doesn't make me take the test. And it's like, so that's, I guess, falls under that, unintended consequence. The teacher thought he was, giving Dylan a pass. But the
Mm,
reality is, Dylan internalized that as, "I'm not good enough."
right. Well, and I think that, I mean, my experience has been, and Charmaine, I'm sure you could agree with this, and is it just a result of disability or something else? But I realized early on that Benjamin was much more intuitive than his sister was. And I think that children with disabilities, and again, there's another article on my website called it "Invisible Abilities," that children with disabilities or adults, they develop compensatory skills. And so they might have limited ability in this area, but they get expanded ability in this area. And so in Benjamin's case, it made him very intuitive. And I know that there are children with autism that people say, "Oh, they're not social, they don't engage." No, a lot of kids with autism, I mean, my son doesn't always make eye contact. I mean, there's an article on the website about that. That Benjamin, he cannot always engage in a conversation and hold his body in space and keep his eye on you. So he might initially make eye contact and then he's going to look away and he's going to have this great conversation, but he's looking over here. Just because he's not looking at you doesn't mean he's not taking it all in. And so Benjamin developed extraordinary hearing, that he can hear stuff in another county and he memorizes it. And so people sometimes would look at Benjamin and think, "Oh, his head is down. He's not paying attention." No, he is paying extravagant attention. Don't think for a second he's not taking it all in, and will repeat it back to you 3 years later, verbatim. And so, we had to be very aware of how intuitive our kids are. Like you said, with Dylan internalizing that, and similar things would, happen with Benjamin, that he would come home and tell me something. I was like, "What?" And it's something that he overheard two adults saying something about him that he heard and internalized it. And then essentially would say, "Well, I can't do that because I have a disability." And I was like, "What? Who told you that?" Nobody told him that. He just overheard it. And so our
Right.
children are very smart. I mean, having a disability does not mean you're stupid. In fact, I'd say a lot of kids with disabilities, again, most of what I've learned have been from people with disabilities. So they're very, very, very smart people, and we need to recognize
Right. Right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Kathie. It's just, you know, I don't know, an honor, which sounds a little weird because we're friends, but
Yeah.
I just always learn from you, and it just always re-energizes me that, we still have work to do and we need to keep on keeping on, because
And
our
the
kids
feeling,
and others depend on
feeling is
us.
mutual, Charmaine, because I learned so much from you. And again, Charmaine is so much more technologically advanced than I am that I'm going to start learning more from her about how to do all this kind of stuff. Because I did get a YouTube channel started. I have one video on there because I just on hold because we moved from Colorado to Texas and it is just sitting there doing nothing. So, Charmaine, you're going to be teaching me all kinds of stuff soon. So, but
Well,
thank you for inviting me. This is a real honor, and I hope that your Facebook fans enjoy this, and hope that they'll make a trip over to my website again. I don't have a Facebook page right now. I may or may not. It just depends on how much time I have to do stuff because I'm a one woman band here. So writing books and presenting and running a store and making products and it's hard to get everything. I want to clone myself, but we're not there yet. So
I know. And I really encourage people to go because, like, I remember, I don't know, a few years ago, Kathie had like 150 articles on her website, and now it's what, like 300?
close to 300. Yes, I mean, if you printed every one, you would have a nice big fat book that it could take you a long time to read. And again, you're welcome to make copies and share them with other people. And probably some of the articles are stuff that some of you as parents have said to yourself that this stuff, but you all know the definition of an expert is anybody from out of town. And so, a lot of times it's the same stuff that you've been telling an educator or a therapist or maybe an extended family member. But if somebody else wrote it, you can say, well, this woman here, she says, so, so if that works for you, I know the same is true for me. I want to share stuff with people, and it's like, well, they're not going to believe me, but if I get it from somebody else and say, well, this person said, and I have it printed, and here's a document or a quote from a website, then it's all to the good. So thank you, Charmaine, very much. It's a real honor to do this, and we'll be in learning from each other continuously. So
I know. And I want to tell people, if they weren't able to catch the live show, this will stay up on my Facebook page as a replay. So, feel free to come back in and share that, and I'll share the URL with Kathie. But go ahead, if you have future questions or comments that come up, type them in, and I'll get with Kathie and we'll get a response back to you, and we'll keep that conversation going. I wanted to let people know that next Monday, Stephen Hinkle from California, a disability rights advocate that happens to have autism, is going to be our guest, and he's going to be talking about the hidden curriculum, different skills that are really important for our students and our children that often get overlooked in this Common Core kind of mania that we have. But so Stephen will be with us next Monday evening. And I want to make sure you tell everybody in your family hi for us. And Dylan's going to be bummed. I should have had him come over because Dylan always calls Kathie his second mom. So I'll have to share the video.
I'm his second mother. I am his second mother. I have more kids than I know what to do with.
I know. But
You give
that's
him a big hug and a kiss.
okay. I will. And to everybody else, have a terrific week, and we shall see you next Monday evening. Bye for now.
Good night. Goodbye.